So to start, my name is Sheftel. I'm here with Darktrace CyberSecurity. I'm sure some of you may have come across our name before, and I'm really here today to speak about using AI to surgically respond and autonomously respond to threats. It's really become a need in the market to be able to use something that can respond to threats without the need of a human, especially for threats that are considered unknown. How are we responding to those threats? And Darktrace is really using AI to surgically respond to that. In terms of digital transformation, to answer that question, I think, in our minds, it's moving from a legacy approach to something that's a little bit more on the proactive side of things, and transforming yourself to being a little bit more autonomous to defend against threats that have never been seen before. And I'll touch on that in a little bit and why autonomous response is so important. A little bit about our company for those of you who are not too familiar with us. Darktrace has recently went public on the London Stock Exchange in the last year, which has really allowed us to do a few things: is increase our growth in our R&D team, and also increase our growth in our core development team. We do have over 70 plus different patents on our self-learning AI technology, and we have almost about 7,000 customers at this point. About 3/4 of those customers are using our autonomous response technology in multiple various points of their infrastructure as well. When we talk about the threat landscape of 2022 and things moving forward, ultimately there's a lot of things that are important here. One of the newest things now is this geopolitical cyber conflict with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. We need to be aware of what's going on. There's a lot of threats that are now coming out of the woodworks of just other countries trying to attack us. So those are now things that we need an autonomous response or some type of capability to stop against these threats that really have not been seen before. When we look at software supply chain attacks, some of the obvious ones like SolarWinds and the most recent Log4j, these are vulnerabilities that have not been seen before, that teams aren't necessarily prepared to defend against. And autonomous response is a capability that's able to help speed teams up to react to some of these software supply chain attacks, where you have so many companies now relying on these third-party providers. How do we know how safe they are? What are we doing to protect ourselves against these third-party software suppliers? Another interesting one where autonomous response is huge is insider threat. I think this is sometimes something that is overlooked. And when we look at today's economy with the Great Resignation, that's real. Companies are hiring and getting rid of people faster than they ever have. Maybe the companies aren't even getting rid of people. It's people deciding to leave and move on to other jobs. And what are these people doing when they're leaving to other jobs that are relevant to what they're doing, or maybe going to a competitor? They're trying to exfil a lot of data, and they're trying to take a lot of sensitive information from your company that they could apply to their own job or maybe send to other competitors in the area. So how are we able to protect against insider threats and things of that nature? And then ransomware. I think this is obviously, the most aware. Everyone knows about ransomware. This is nothing new, but ransomware is going to continue to evolve. It's going to get more novel. If we're not putting some type of system in place to prevent against an unknown threat, you're really leaving essentially the back door of your house open to some type of attack to sneak in. And when we look at cybersecurity as a whole, these two stats here on the right are rather interesting. When we see that almost 80% of IT professionals are lacking confidence in their overall security posture, and 22% of those people feel that they lack visibility in the cloud. So how are we able to bring that gap? How are we able to bridge that gap? And when we really take a look at all of the products on the market, while there's a lot of good products on the market, what we're really seeing is that most of these products have the rear view mirror approach mentality, which is essentially reliant on a rule and a signature or some type of playbook, relying on known attacks to predict the future unknown, which is interesting. If you think about that, we're taking so much data of known attacks. How can a known attack start to identify a future unknown attack? And that's the ultimate problem and gap that we're trying to fill today. It's a retrospective approach, and it ultimately leaves companies with complete lack of visibility or context into certain parts of their environment, how are they protecting against the unknown? And a lot of the times what this ends up becoming are responses in twofold, either a response that is too timid, which is ultimately allowing the threat to progress and proceed within the organization and not taking that proportionate response, or in some of the worst case could be a little bit too aggressive, which is shutting down the entire business, shutting down the network, shutting down those devices, shutting down those servers, and ultimately slowing down the business and not allowing the business to continue operating as normal. And that is costing companies dollars. And it's really an ineffective approach. And that's ultimately what brings us to Darktrace. And the circle here is really an evolving circle. And we have our Darktrace self-learning AI at the core technology of what Darktrace is offering. And what this is doing is constantly analyzing connections. It's constantly understanding a normal pattern of life for each specific user, device, and server across your infrastructure. And taking that sense of normal, we're able to go ahead and detect subtle indications of something that may be not normal, maybe an unusual connection for a device to be connecting to some type of rare IP or rare website that's never been seen before within the environment. And just as granular as our detection piece is our response piece. And our response piece is a very proportionate action. And that is allowing the business to continue operating as normal, not taking that too aggressive approach and not taking that too timid approach, by interrupting the threat and allowing the business to really keep continuing operating as normal. The core issue we're trying to solve here is making sure that the business can continue operating even in the event of an attack. On top of that, what we're also doing is layering investigation. So Darktrace is really helping to lift your team up, allowing your team to investigate these attacks while they're happening. Darktrace is going to investigate that for you. Give your security team the information that they need to understand what is going on while keeping the human in the loop at all times. We're not trying to come in and fully automate everything. We still want to keep the human in the loop. What we're doing here is simply speeding up your human team, shortening that time to meeting by detecting, responding, and investigating, while also importantly integrating with your current tools, right? We want to integrate with your current tools. We don't want to come in and be an unsiloed tool. One of the issues we're seeing in the market is that we have so many different tools that are not talking to each other. IT teams are coming in, logging into 4 different tools in the morning across network and endpoint and email, but nothing is correlated and speaking together. And that's really where Darktrace can come in and integrate and keep that full circle human loop, constantly evolving, constantly analyzing your environment and understanding normal. The autonomous response portion. So the question that we're really answering here is, what is the minimal amount of action that autonomous response can take to stop the threat while allowing the business to continue? We don't want to be shutting down the business. The ultimate problem we're trying to solve is here, yes, we want to stop the breach, but more importantly, we need the business to continue operating as normal, because that's a loss of revenue for these businesses. And that's where autonomous response really kicks in. From that precise understanding of normal using that self-learning AI, the autonomous response can take a very proportionate and targeted action to neutralize the threat, stop it from continuing, alerting your team on what's going on, investigating that for you, speeding up that time to meeting, and allowing your team to get in there and mitigate that risk. So allowing the business to continue uninterrupted by acting very proportionately, and ultimately doing that across the entire digital estate. So not just in one portion, but offering autonomous response across your entire digital estate, which essentially would be your email, your network, your cloud environment, your SaaS apps, and your endpoint. Ideally, where do we want to have some autonomous response or some type of level of autonomous response is across all these points of your infrastructure. Having that layered approach and knowing that autonomous response is there to stop these threats that have not been seen before, that a legacy approach or a rule and signature may not be able to identify, which I covered on earlier, like an insider threat or a novel piece of ransomware coming in at any one of these points. Some of the integrations that we do have here, this by all means is not an exhaustive list, but I'm sure you know some of the other major players that you may know from the endpoint side of things, SaaS, cloud side of things. Those are all things that we do integrate with, but autonomous response and Darktrace is really meant to integrate with your current stack and not necessarily come in and replace everything. So giving you that capability to actually autonomous respond to some type of malicious alert. So in an example of how autonomous response would actually stop a threat, we can take this scenario where you have your standard phishing type email where employee gets an email. Everyone probably in this room has an employee that's going to click on a link. It's just a matter of when they're going to do it, not really if. In the event that an email were to come in, Darktrace is able to identify that unusual connection. As that employee clicks on that, Darktrace will go ahead and sever that connection between that endpoint and that rare IP, allowing that person to continue operating as normal, but just severing that one malicious connection. In the event the attack continues, I think one point to note here is if you're looking at this in the eyes of an insider threat, not every attack starts via an email. Majority of attacks do, but in the event of an insider threat, an insider may start right here at number 2 and start command and control and try to continue outside. Darktrace will identify that as unusual behavior for that user, and again, sever only that malicious connection. If, again, the attack were to continue and the user were to try to upload sensitive documents into that SaaS environment, OneDrive being an example, Darktrace and Tagina, our autonomous response, again, can stop that specific data upload, not allowing them to upload that data to get outside of the organization while disrupting that illegitimate activity and allowing them to continue operating as normal. Again, a lot of this is about taking proportionate action and allowing normal conditions to continue. When we look at an example of a case study here, we have the Log4j vulnerability, which was something obviously very recent that we're all pretty much aware of. And this is something where speed really matters, right? When this came out, this is something that is unknown to every industry, unknown. And when it's unknown and attackers find out about it, they're essentially spraying and praying across every organization they can, basically racing those IT teams to patch those vulnerabilities. In this case, it's a matter of who gets there first. So in this case, without ever being known, autonomous response and our self-learning is able to quickly identify that an interfacing server was breached, identified this rare IP, and saw some malware delivery. From that case, went in and severed that malicious connection. So very proportionate and targeted action, again, bringing this to an end. Having autonomous response there is something that can act immediately, stop things immediately, rather than waiting on an IT team to come in there, identify every single software that's using Log4j and going in there and trying to patch all of those vulnerabilities. How much time are they going to take to do all that? And who's going to win the race? Is it going to be your IT team or is it going to be the attackers? And that's why autonomous response is so important, because it can help you speed that up and reduce the risk of losing the fight to an attacker. When something like that does happen, you have our AI Analyst Summary. This is our cyber AI analyst, which is automated investigations. So while something like this is going on in the background, our cyber AI analyst, which was founded over about 4 years of actually watching our internal SOC team investigate and triage and report on events, will do all of this heavy lifting for you. String together a bunch of individual alerts, create a natural language processing report for you, identify any additional ports that were scanned, any other devices that were touched, and send you this report, as well as any autonomous response actions that were taken. This is all happening in real time as the attack is going on, giving your team complete visibility into what's going on, and ultimately it's just allowing them to speed up and get the information they need as quick as possible, rather than investigating manually, which could take 30 minutes, hours, depend on how experienced your IT team is. So obviously, when it comes to autonomous response, nobody just wants to hand over the keys to the castle and say, hey, here, autonomously defend my network. That's something that we feel, strong in by going with our maturity model. So the maturity model is really meant to help you and your team build trust. During a proof of value, if anyone has questions on a proof of value or a trial, feel free to reach out to me after this. But during a trial, what we do to build trust with teams is we put you in passive mode. So throughout the trial, you will see the AI working in your environment, and we will specifically tell you, this is the action that autonomous response would have taken if it were in fully autonomous mode. Typically, once our clients move into customer, within the first month, they stay in human confirmation mode. Human confirmation mode is just keeping the human in the loop, telling you the action that autonomous response wants to take, but before it takes that action, sending you a notification to your mobile device or the device in which you log into and say, hey, autonomous response wants to sever this connection. Do you agree? Yes or no? And allowing you to understand the type of actions that it wants to take. And lastly, fully autonomous mode. Fully autonomous mode, typically after about 2 or 3 months, most of our customers are in fully autonomous mode. And that's ultimately where you're able to let the autonomous actions run on their own. You're able to also target specific actions. We do talk a lot of CISOs who may put autonomous mode on the most severe actions on some of the endpoints, where if it does want to quarantine a device, it's only a single laptop or it's only a single device, rather than making it really strong on a server, for example, where you wouldn't want that server or critical device to be going down, but you still want autonomous response to sever connections. So you can really think of this as a dial and something that we can work with you to tune to really have different levels of autonomous response across all different parts of your infrastructure, pinpointing some of those devices that may be more critical or less critical than others. So really, really lightweight and ultimately scalable and configurable based on your business's needs and your appetite for risk. And the last slide here, just some quotes, from some of our customers on autonomous response and how they feel it's really something that's able to keep them up to speed with these new attacks that are coming, including AI attacks, which are approaching in the near term. And that's pretty much all that I have.